Good evening. My name is Anna Lopez, and I'm a student with the MBA program at Union University. I chose to do my paper on the history and laws of organ donation, a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Before I get into the PowerPoint and all the history and laws around organ donation, I wanted to share with you just a few interesting statistics. That every 18 minutes, someone loses their life waiting for an organ. Every 10 minutes, another name is added to the list. One donor can save or improve the lives of 50 people with either tissue, eyes, organs, and bone transplants. There are 120,000 people in the United States that are on a waiting list, and about only 50% nationwide do people donate organs. So pretty interesting facts of how we need to really make awareness and improve the organ donation process or improve actually the amount of organ donation that we see. So now as I move into the actual history and laws of organ donation. 1954 was the first successful kidney donation from a living donor, but it wasn't until 1962 that the first kidney, liver, and lung organ donation occurred from a deceased donor. And then 1968, we had three big areas that we'll discuss is the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. The actual first definition of brain death was established, and that first organ procurement organization was established, which is very important with organ donation. And then 1980, they determined the Uniform Determination of Death Act. And then 1984, the National Organ Transplant Act, which was important, and we'll get into for standardizing and making a better network process of sharing organs across the United States. And then 1987, we had the revised Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, and then again in 2006 and 2007 were the final revisions to what we know today as the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. Baseline regulations that allowed us to set guidelines and establish a process for organ donation that states and healthcare systems could live by. The original, like you see, was composed in 1968, and it consisted of 7 sections. Section 1 defines the act in regards to the regulations and license for the banks and the facilities that houses the bodies and organs of the donors. This also defines the roles of everyone involved, from the donor to the hospital to the physicians, anyone or any entity that was part of the process. Section 2 defines who can consent for the organs, to donate organs. Anyone can sign a directive donating their organs, but if they are deceased and has not signed or registered to donate organs, the next of kin, such as a spouse or child or parent, can consent organ donation on behalf of the patient. It's a list by priority and can be stopped by someone considered in the family with a higher priority. If there is a wife and the children say that they were okay with donating their parents' organs, and the mom showed up and she said no, then the organs would not be donated. They also made sure that there was an examination done of the patient before any organs were transplanted to make sure they were safe to transplant the organs from one patient to another. Section 3 lists the persons that can become donees, which includes the recipients, hospitals, physicians, medical schools and dental schools for education, and actually how the gifts were to be used. A patient can say, or whoever's donating their loved one's organs can say, I want my loved one's organs donated to education or for therapy, to transplant into another patient. Section 4 defines the actual consent process for the donor. By will or donor card is one thing. A patient can sign a donor card. They can specify again who they want the organs to go to therapy or to research. The process does, if the patient does not have a donor card, the process in the hospital does take a two-patient witness or two-people witness. So if you're going to donate your organs and you sign in the hospital, then you have to have 2 signatures. If it's your loved one that's donating on your behalf, then there has to be a legal signature signed by 2 patients or 2 witnesses. Section 5 discusses the actual delivery to whom the gift is given. This can also be identified on the card. The documentation of the release for the procedure can be kept at the hospital, a bank, or registry for records. Excuse me. Section 6 states that the donor can revoke the gifts, stating to the physician or taking back the original consent to donate at any time. It's giving you a way out. And then Section 7, I guess, is also where your organs can be accepted or rejected, that there's the right to say that we cannot use your organs, or your organs are not good, or not they're saying they're not good, they cannot be used in this situation. So these were the initial 7 baseline requirements that made up the very first 1968 Uniform Anatomical Gift Act that kind of started the organ donation process. There's 2 that we're going to talk about, the DDR for brain death and the DDR for cardiac death. And the dead donor rule is not a law, it's actually a regulation that guides the ethical reasoning that supports organ donation. And it was in 1968 that the first organ was recovered from a brain dead donor patient. But it wasn't until 1968 that the definition of brain death was established. And brain death was based on neurological criteria and was developed by the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee and Henry Beecher. This criteria is kind of what laid the ground rules and regulations for the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act in 1968. Brain dead organs are the main source of organ donation. With the Anatomical Gift Act also came the dead donor rule. So the dead donor rule says that death cannot be caused by removing organs, and that vital organs should only be taken from people that are dead. And that's the struggle, and why the DDR causes some limitations when we're actually trying to donate organs or get organs donated, and it causes limitations with the procurement process for organ donation. So physicians were challenged by the DDR to develop criteria for declaring patients dead and to start reducing the denial of patients who want to donate their organs. They were obviously not going to, make it. So these people had requested that, but because there were no rules or guidelines put in place, it kind of made it harder to follow. So the first step in developing this criteria was to actually, what does the concept brain death mean? So the patient had to have lost all functions, including the brain stem, to be declared brain dead. These patients were going to be on life support for life, no matter, there was no waking up, there was no brain function. This had to be, this had to be the state of the patient in order to be able to donate their organs. So under the Uniform Determination of Death Act, and was adopted by every state in 1981, was the need for a living body from a dead donor with the irreversible cessation of function of the entire brain was considered brain dead, and they could use their organs for transplant. So the UDDA made the final definition: an individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory function or irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain and brainstem is considered dead. So what this law and this definition did is it allowed you to transplant organs from a patient who was considered dead before removing life support, because these patients were not going to go back to any normal functions, but we needed that body, that living body, to house those organs until we could transplant them, and you did not need to stop life support before transplanting the organs. Where it gets a little grayer to me and a little harder to follow is whenever you look at the DDR for cardiac death. The whole point of the DDR and these rules and these guidelines was just to assure everybody that we were following measures and guidelines to assure everyone that these patients were dead and what we were doing was ethical, or what people are doing is ethical. So this gave everybody kind of a sigh of relief that we're following some guidelines that's acceptable for physicians, patients, hospitals, and everybody involved. So when we look at the rules established by the DDR for circulatory death, which is also known as circulatory determination of death, which is the DCDD, which this can all get a lot of real confusing. And with cardiac death, because it is a little bit grayer and a little bit harder to follow the rules, we actually lose out on organs. We actually miss out on organs that we could share and improve someone else's life or save someone else's life. But the guidelines that were established were for irreversible loss of circulatory function, states that the person must be pulseless for 2 minutes. And since circulatory function can be restored with CPR, you have to wait until the entire team is confident the heart will not start back on its own and the patient or the patient's loved one have agreed to no resuscitation or CPR for the patient. But where it gets even grayer is that a patient becomes, this process becomes the center of a debate, because if you're a patient and you choose to be a do not resuscitate, a DNR, but you're not donating your organs, at the minute that your heart rate or you're pronounced dead at the minute of asystole, which is there's time for CPR. So you're saying I don't want to have life-saving measures. So at that moment you're pronounced dead. But based on the cardiac death rules, the physician has to wait these 2 to 5 minutes and not administer CPR in order to donate organs. And we do this, that this is more acceptable, well, because to the physicians and the public, we're reassuring you that this patient is, we're not looking at this patient as just a donor. We're looking at this patient as a human being and doing the ethical and proper thing by this patient. Another part of the cardiac death is some of the overlapping of inconsistencies with the CPR. They're saying, with CPR, a patient can be without, can restore function up to 10 to 15 minutes after they arrest with CPR. So there you get in these times where one place is 2 to 5 minutes, but you could still do CPR 10 to 15 minutes after a patient arrest and still have life-saving measures. But in order to save the heart in cardiac death patients is where it gets a little bit more challenging, because your patients, you're not going to do CPR, you're not going to do arrest, but you have to wait till all circulatory functions stop. And in the OR, when you're waiting, that's 60 minutes, and that is just not enough time to save the heart organ. So a lot of times you lose out on the heart for cardiac death patients, but you still have your liver, your lungs, your kidneys, and pancreas, and all that. So you do still get to save some organs. One other factor that the DDR was able to accept was that they removed the word irreversible and made it to permanent, violating instead of to functions to declare death. That way the patient could consent to donate with the consent to withdraw life-saving measures, made this more ethical by the DDR guidelines by exchanging the words from irreversible to permanent. So as you can see, it can be a little bit hard to follow the cardiac death compared to brain death. Brain death is cut and dry. If you have no more function in the brain and brainstem and you're on life support, but with the heart, cardiac death, you have a little bit more rules of having to wait before you can go right into organ donation. So in 1987, there were revised Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. There were 5 changes that came in the 1987 revision. One, obvious, they prohibited the selling of organs. That's illegal. You can't sell organs. They needed clarity to support donors' request. And what this means is that if you signed that you wanted to consent to donate your organs, that your family couldn't overstep your request to donate your organs, even if you had signed to donate your organs and they were not there, they could still donate your organs or, go on with the process. The third revision was some just compliance for completing the documentation and having a more standardized process and making sure that all the documentation was getting done. The fourth section was the mandate for hospitals to inquire about the patient's wishes around organ donation. When a patient comes into the hospital, they ask their wish. I mean, are you an organ donor? And if you are, how do you want to donate your organs? And then the fifth one was medical examiner's rights to donate. And this was kind of a gray area too. The only time a medical examiner could donate the organs is if there was no one who accepted the body. And usually they're going to donate it to education or research. So there had to be some guidelines changed. Only 26 states accepted these new changes, which left more inconsistencies across the country on the organ donation process. And that was really where this next revisions in 2006 and 2007 come into play, because to have a successful organ donation procurement process, you really need this to be standardized across all systems, and this is the best for everyone involved. You're going to get a better organ donation networking. So in 2006, the revisions, again, they even strengthened the documentation process more. And this is where they took it a step farther and they created a document of referral that bars anyone from deciding on your behalf. So if you say, I want to donate, you get to donate. If you say, I am not an organ donation donor, nobody can come in and overrule the document that you declared that you wanted to or not. And it makes it clear that no one can override the deceased decision. And then there was more clear revisions and set guidelines on who has the right to decide to donate organs if the request has not been made by the patient prior. The person making the decision has to be an individual who is responsible for making healthcare decisions on the patient's behalf. 2006 changes also say the case the family is divided, the decision goes to the majority. So if you have a family of 7 and 3 want it and 4 don't, then the 4 are going to overrule the 3. And then it also said that minors on their driver's license could determine if they want to be an organ donor or not. And probably the biggest and most significant to me in the 2006 revision is the donor registries and the rights of the procurement program. They established this registry, and these registries were established where all the information from who is on the driver's license with the DMV has said that they want to be an organ donor. This all goes into this registry. And the organ procurement program has 24 hours a day, 7 days a week access to this information, so we can better be equipped to establish and be more efficient in the way we donate organs and timelines. I mean, with organ donation, it's all about the timing. It's you don't have a lot of time to sit and wait and go through all kinds of documentation. This is a one-stop shop for procurement programs to have all the information that they need right there at their fingertips. And another big one is the organ donation and being a DNR. The patient can establish themselves as a DNR and have the right to donate without life-saving measures. And what this does is it allows the measures to begin to preserve the organs. So the patient this defines it in more detail that the patient that has a healthcare directive and states he does not want life-saving measures is not saying he's refusing organ donation. He is just making the process faster. A donor can decide who he wants or who they want to receive their organs, and if the request has not been made, then the organ procurement program is the one who allocates the organs. And if it's not determined for therapy or research, that goes to therapy versus research. So the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network, the OPTN, was a unified network that was established by Congress under the National Transplant Act of 1984. And this was a law that mandated the allocation of organs to be done on a national basis, as well as guarded through a private partnership. And this private partnership was developed for the 1984 Act with the United Network for Organ Sharing, and the goal was to allocate these organs in a fair and efficient manner for everyone. So those were some important pieces of the 2006 revision that gave everybody a little bit more comfort in how we're donating our organs. But the most controversial change was for the physicians. There was a requirement for physicians to continue life-saving measures until the organ procurement organization could determine if the patient could be a donor. Well, physicians didn't agree. They didn't want to agree that we're going to keep these patients living on until we can determine if they're a donor without the patient knowing that that's what was going on. So that's when the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services required hospitals to notify your local procurement program and have someone speak to the family. And this person, the Medicare's and Medicaid, also said that this person has to be a trained individual who can speak to these families and make sure they understand what's going on and consent to this. And a lot of times it can be a physician, and a physician can do the talk, but most of the time that's not the case, because the physician is the advocate also for the patient that comes in the door. That's his first priority. So a lot of times there's that worry that the patient's loved ones feel as if he's more worried about getting the organs donated than he is for taking care of their patient. So they have this associate who works for your local organ donation program who comes in and takes over from that point and goes over all the processes and the consent process and is your guide through the entire process. So in closing, this is not a perfect process. It still has its ups and downs and things that have to be worked through. But over the years, it's really established a much more streamlined, focused, national focus with networking and sharing, and have really worked to get it a little bit more streamlined. Like I said, personally, I can tell you that there's still more that needs to be done to improve this process, but I know it's what we have now and definitely has strengthened over the past 40 plus years to what we know today as the 2006 revision, 2007 revision of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. So that's just a small amount on organ donation. That's a very large topic with many things we could go into discussion. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.